everybody. How is everyone doing today? Just trying to get my camera on. There we go. It's always good when the tech works. So thanks very much for joining us this morning for a session where we're going to be discussing sustainability of the tech sector. I think we all often look to technology to improve our sustainability, whether it's things like replacing travel with video conferencing, creating paperless offices, using cloud computing. But we have to ask, what is the cost? Is the technology that we're using as green as it?
Laura, I can't hear you. I don't know if anybody else has the same problem.
Okay, can anybody else
must
see
be
me?
I think it might be me.
Oh,
Sorry.
Everyone else can hear. Can you hear you now, Suzanne? Because that's...
Sorry, that was me. Not you. Yes, sorry to interrupt. Okay, thanks.
That's no problem. Best that we get these things sorted. So there's Suzanne introducing herself. She's going to be joining us on stage on the screen shortly. Suzanne's partner at EMR, which is Environmental Resources Management, and chair of Tech UK's Climate Council. And I'm thrilled that Daniel Fratte has managed to join us from Barcelona. We're having some difficulty getting him registered, but we've managed to get him in the room, so that's great. So what I was saying was, what responsibility do we have as a sector, not as individual organisations, but as the sector overall? What is our responsibility to make sure that the offer that we're creating for customers is green and is sustainable? So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Suzanne, who is going to talk about some of the environmental, social and governance trends that ERM anticipate will impact the industry most, and discuss why climate pledges just aren't enough and we need to be doing more. So thanks very much, Suzanne.
Thank you, Laura. I do have a few slides to share, so let me just bring that up. Okay, can you see that all right? So yeah, thank you for the introduction, Laura. My name is Susanna Baker and I'm a partner at ERM. ERM is the world's largest pure play sustainability consultancy. And I work specifically in the technology sector, working with our clients there on corporate responsibility and sustainability and climate change and product stewardship as well. As Laura mentioned, I was recently elected chair of Tech UK's Climate Council. And in fact, prior to joining ERM, I was head of climate, environment and sustainability at Tech UK for around 7 years. So I've been working with the sector for nearly a decade now on sustainability issues. So the slides I want to share with you today really highlight a report that we published a few months ago, which looked at some of the kind of key trends that we are expecting in the coming year within the tech sector. Now, the tech sector is often highlighted as a potential solution to climate change and our sustainability woes. And there is some fantastic innovation underway applying digital technology to sustainability challenges. There's no doubt about that. But in order for us to be really credible in presenting solutions in this space, we also need to get our own house in order. The first, of course, is around climate action. And last year we saw a real swell of in the number of companies committing to climate action. So at the beginning of the year, we saw around 6% of the tech sector by revenue committing to science-based targets. Now, these are the most stringent and rigorous targets that companies can set. They're seen as a gold standard because you're committing to cut your carbon in line with what's needed to achieve the Paris Agreement. And at the beginning of the year, 6% of tech companies around the world by revenue had committed to SBTIs. Just before COP, we saw that had gone up to nearly 50%. So that was a dramatic increase in the number of targets being set, the number of pledges and promises being made by the sector to substantially deal with their carbon emissions. And we've even seen in the sector some world-leading climate commitments. And I think Microsoft is often highlighted as not having set just a commitment to reduce their emissions, but to actually eradicate the emissions that they have been responsible through the entire life of their being. But despite having all these wonderful promises, we can now expect to see more scrutiny. We want to know, I think we're starting to see civil society and governments wanting to know how companies are going to meet those commitments. So, for example, we want to see, or the civil society want to see interim targets, a real clear understanding of how companies are intending to meet those long-term targets. Carbon offsets, while definitely having a role in climate action, are not themselves a credible way to meet long-term targets, although they are kind of acceptable in use for the short term, and there's clearly a role for them. So interim targets, clear transparency over the use of carbon offsetting, and clarity over how renewable energy is going to be integrated, for example, into your business. These issues are the types of things that civil society and governments are increasingly looking at, and potentially even your customers and supply chain too, because actually what we're going to start to see is climate commitments increasingly focusing on supply chains. Now in IT, in our sector, we are above average in having most of our emissions based in supply chains. Around 97% of the average US IT companies' emissions are actually within the supply chain, not within their direct scope of influence. In order to move credibly on climate, we need to focus on supply chains, and that's going to require partnership, collaboration, and as we've seen in companies like Apple, is the rollout of renewables throughout the supply chain. And really supporting their suppliers to adopt renewable energy and energy efficiency. And finally, on climate, we're going to start to see, I think, even more concern growing about the energy intensity of digital technologies and the local impact of infrastructure, digital infrastructure. So, for example, fairly recently, we saw a moratorium on new build of data centers in the Netherlands because regulators were really concerned about the local demand on energy and the local demands of water and what that meant for other users in the region. So digital infrastructure providers and operators are really going to have to think about how they can mitigate these concerns. And I'm sure Daniel will talk more about some of the energy intensity of digital technologies such as AI, blockchain, and of course, Bitcoin, which has been receiving quite a lot of press recently. Now, I talked a bit about supply chain sustainability in respect to climate, but actually, I think what we're going to start to see is a much more holistic approach to how we consider supply chain sustainability, with climate being one element. Now, the sector's already actually quite good at working with supply chains to carry out due diligence, particularly around so-called conflict minerals. That's been a legal requirement of the large tech firms for many years. And what that requires is an assessment of the potential risks, human rights and social risks in a supply chain, and to actively manage those risks. Now, what we're going to start to see, partly because of a kind of swell of regulation across Europe, including new proposals from the European Commission, is a focus on the value chain, and that's both for environmental and human rights risks. So the regulatory focus is absolutely becoming stronger. It kind of started with the German supply chain law, which came into force or comes into force next year, I believe. And there is new legislation being proposed in the Netherlands, Belgium, for example, and of course this European proposal as well. And underpinning all of this, I think it'd be remiss not to mention the role that digital technologies can play in increasing the transparency of value chains. Companies like the UK Circular are using blockchain to, for example, to trace the provenance of materials all the way from source through the supply chain to the end user. And that is proving to be extremely powerful when companies are being increasingly expected to understand what's happening within their supply chains and having that transparency. Another key issue for the sector is around e-waste and the move towards circular business models, which is focused on using materials and components and products for as long as possible to mitigate the climate and environmental impact of resource extraction and e-waste at the end of life. E-waste is still a huge issue globally. In the UK and Europe, we do have extended producer responsibility regimes which require producers of electronics to pay for their recycling at the end of life, but it's always been quite waste focused, and I think we can expect to see government look to reform the UK's EPR system to incentivize more reuse, to encourage more circular business models. So there is less focus just on the waste, but to try and encourage more activity in further up the kind of waste hierarchy. We can also expect to see in Europe and probably very likely to be mirrored in the UK, new regulations that will set minimum standards for product design that will again encourage repair, durability, durable electronics, and remanufacturing of those products once they have finished their end of first life. So the European Commission is currently looking at laptops, computers, desktop computers and smartphones. So that should come out probably later this year or early next year. And I think the UK will be kind of hot on the heels of the Commission in putting in place measures in this space. So we can definitely expect to see lots of interest and activity there. Equally, I mean, the number of metals and minerals in e-waste is astonishing. And many of those elements are now in competition with those sectors who are rolling out other low carbon technology and infrastructure that's critical for ensuring that we meet as a country our climate commitments. So I think, again, we're going to start to see efforts via government to retrieve more critical raw materials from used electronics. And indeed, in the net zero strategy, there was a commitment to start looking at critical raw materials and the UK strategy to access these materials. I would be very surprised if electronics didn't feature in that strategy in one form or another. And finally, I just wanted to touch on nature-related impacts. It may seem as if the tech sector is quite divorced from nature, but I think later this year, China is due to hold a huge conference similar to COP26 for climate, but this is one completely focused on biodiversity. It's been postponed because of COVID. Hopefully it won't be postponed again this year. But alongside this huge conference looking at biodiversity, there is also a very influential task force looking at how companies can start to account for the impact of nature and biodiversity on their business. It's called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. While the tech sector is already investing a lot in natural climate solutions or carbon offsets to compensate for their carbon footprints, we can start to see the impact of these big discussions and initiatives starting to increase awareness of our dependency on healthy ecosystems and, of course, water, because data centers are water intensive. Although a lot of effort is being made to try and mitigate that. So amongst the trends we're expecting to see here are stronger commitments from the tech sector towards a nature positive future, more investment in biodiversity and water related rehabilitation of ecosystems, and more technology firms striving to be water positive to try and mitigate some of those issues around water. So that's it from me. I just want this quick canter through, but if you wanted to read more about this subject, we have produced a report called Sustainable Business Trends 2002, and that will be that's available from the ERM website. So yeah, please have a peruse if that's something of interest.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. Are you happy for me to share the link to the,
yes, please
to that
do.
on your website? Okay, I'll do that shortly whilst Daniel's chatting. I did forget to mention that we are running some polls just to really test out where you're currently at with sustainability in your business and whether or not you're aware of some of the, I guess, the statistics and some of the kind of the high level claims around tech, just to sort of gauge where we're at, I suppose, as the sector in the region. So those are going on alongside the presentations. So thanks so much, Suzanne. I do want to pick up on a couple of the things that you talked about, but I think I'll wait until the end once we've heard Daniel, and then the three of us can have a little bit of a chat if there's some time left, and hopefully we'll get some questions from the audience as well. Please feel free to post your questions as Suzanne and Daniel are talking, and we'll pick them up at the end. So thanks very much for joining us this morning, Daniel, who is lead software engineer at ThoughtWorks and proclaimed green tech advocate. He's joining us from Barcelona this morning, so another brilliant example, I guess, of us not having to travel and to save some of that carbon emissions. And Daniel's going to be introducing us to the green software engineering principles and offering some thoughts about practical steps that we can take to make the sector more sustainable. So thanks very much, Daniel.
Perfect. First of all, is the audio okay? Because I have some technical. Okay, great. I had some not the best to start the morning with some technical issues. Thank you, Laura, and amazing presentation, Suzanne. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel, and I'm gonna take us through some of these, let's say, concepts that are being discussed in the IT community regarding sustainability. And I do have a couple of slides. So can people, is that okay? Are you seeing the slides already? Great. So let's see now if it works if I put it on slideshow. All right. Still good? Perfect. So this is a short talk that it's called a practical introduction to green tech. It touches on many angles, and hopefully we can try to address again some of these things that are being discussed in the community. Of course, maybe for this audience, it's not necessary to highlight for others it is, right? But you know, the need for this type of talks or events right now. Okay, it's this aim of having the Earth temperature below 1.5 degrees. This is out of the IPCC report that you may be aware of. And, you know, there are some facts and figures out there, right, that are pretty helpful. But the situation that we're dealing here with, climate change, it's quite complex, right? And even though some of these facts and figures are quite reliable, again, it's a problem that needs to be tackled from multiple angles. I do believe one thing to be like unquestionable or almost like a hard truth, which is that technology by itself won't save us, right? So we need to have, you know, citizens and consumers having, you know, making individual decisions or choices on an everyday basis, right? That have sustainability in that equation. We need to have corporations, you know, using their platforms for change, and we need to have public policy in place, right? Now, talking about technology, even though it won't save us, it will play a significant role in helping us fight climate change. So context matters here in terms of definitions. There are a lot of buzzwords, and this is a super emergent field, and things are being defined, redefined, and, you know, we need to bear with that as we go. But like a clear-cut separation seems to be well established. And is this differentiation between what we can call sustainability of IT versus sustainability by IT. And Susan already talked about some of these already, right? The first bucket is, how do we make our IT infrastructure, and let's loosely define that for a moment, more sustainable, right? More efficient in terms of energy, in terms of carbon, etc. And the second bucket, it's sustainability by IT, and it's basically how do we optimize real world processes, let's say supply chains, by using technology, right? So it's a separation or a difference to keep to keep handy, right, in mind. Now, when we talk about the first bucket, or sustainability of IT, you might have heard people already talking about green software, right? And, you know, what does that mean in the first place, right? It's tricky to get a clear-cut definition, but as a baseline, we can think of green software as, you know, software applications / components that emit less carbon. And you can start pulling from that thread, right? And it gets even more and more complicated. And you reach a level in which you get to talk about carbon efficiency and carbon awareness. And you have even more, you know, more levels to break that down, right? You can talk about hardware efficiency, software efficiency, temporal awareness, or spatial awareness, right? For example, temporal and spatial awareness are quite interesting. You know, are we running our applications at times or in places where renewable energies are, you know, being fired up, or are, you know, the most used in the grids? So, you know, that can trigger a whole bunch of analysis on where and when to run our workloads. And what you see now on screen, it's what's being called the 8 green software engineering principles. This is work that is being done by the Green Software Foundation, of which at ThoughtWorks we are a founding member, alongside with multiple other organizations. And it's kind of like a checklist on you know, principles and patterns that are being, you know, defined, that are emerging when we talk about making applications more sustainable, right? So we can talk about carbon and electricity as, you know, how to make applications more efficient on those 2 dimensions. And usually electricity is a proxy to carbon, so those 2 are related. Carbon intensity, maybe we can discuss about that one in particular, but, you know, can we consume electricity with the lowest carbon intensity, meaning the fact that we can run applications using dirty or clean electricity, right? And how do we move along that spectrum, right? Embodied carbon, build applications that are hardware efficient. So me as a developer, I work at a company in which we have a laptop renewal policy, you know, that is X amount of years. Is that X like a good amount of years to amortize the almost 400 kilos that it took to produce my Mac or my computer? You know, that's like a rule of thumb, or like a heuristic that we should, you know, follow, amortizing the amount that it takes to produce a device as throughout as many years as possible. Energy proportionality, maximizing the energy efficiency of hardware, and networking, reducing the amount of data and distance that it must travel across the network. These two are more leaning towards servers or workloads in the cloud. Demand shaping, build carbon-aware applications. Have you noticed how Netflix degrades the movie you're watching sometimes when bandwidth is not available? Well, can you think, and maybe this is food for thought, right? But maybe can businesses afford to degrade the performance of their services, their products and services when renewables are not in the grid? That's something to think of, right? And that's demand shaping. You know, how do you shape the demand of your products and services? And measure and optimization, I think that's quite self-explanatory and a good segue into the next slide, which is a little bit of our effort here at the company to try to shed some light on some of these things, right? So we built this tool given a need of multiple of our clients and partners, right? For a couple of years now, they have been asking, hey, can you help us in our sustainable transformation journey, or you know, whatever they're calling it in every company, right? But then again, you know, any effort, any analysis is as good as the data that we have available, right? And nowadays, businesses, they own distributed systems in the cloud, right? And it's quite tricky to, you know, define boundaries, define scopes, and get a good measurement of the application, right? Of the software application. So this is one attempt that we're currently refining as a free and open source tool in order to measure the emissions of workloads in the cloud, software applications deployed in the cloud. Just, you know, something to keep in mind, and it's again free for everyone to try and contribute to. And last but not least, it has proven to be useful in this sustainable transformation journey that I was referring to before, to think, you know, most of these techniques, the technicalities of them, you know, like being more efficient or, you know, saving energy, or they're not necessarily new, right? Some of these things, they can be put on under other disciplines, perhaps, you know, computer science optimization or algorithmic efficiency. So these are things that have existed for, I don't know, 50 years or something, right? But what seems to be new is the cultural change into corporations to address the problem, right? So we don't have any time to waste here. And this organizational framework that you see on screen, it's, you know, how modern tech businesses are organizing themselves to build products, to build software products, right? And it proved to be a good exercise to, you know, with clients and partners to sit down and analyze how this new carbon accountable mindset that I'm telling you about looks in every type of team, right? So basically the takeaway here is that in a large organization or in a mid-sized organization or even in a small organization, the carbon accountable mindset and the tasks that need to be driven by each type of team, they're going to look slightly different, right? So a product team building a shopping cart in order to make their work, their product, their component more sustainable, they're going to do things slightly different as a platform team or a FinOps team or a finance team or even the C-level executives, right? So it's an initiative, or it's a mindset that is cross organization, but, you know, the tasks that every team carries out, they're different. And I think that's it. It was a bit of a, you know, a whole bunch of topics all mixed up, but they're all related, and hopefully we can, you know, start pulling from this and see what comes out of it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. There was an awful lot in there, I think, for us to digest this morning. I hope everybody's got their coffee, because this has been an awful lot of information, I think, for us to take in. If anybody does have any questions, you can use the Q&A tab or post them in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. In the meantime, I've got a couple of questions for you both, and I love listening to the two of you talk, partly because you're both so passionate about this, and it's so inspiring, I think, listening to the two of you, but also I love watching you nod along to what the other one's saying. It just goes to show how much we're on the same page here. I wanted to I guess explore that a little bit further. One of the things that you talked about, Suzanne, is well, it was in relation to the emissions from supply chains. I forget what the figure was you used. Was it 90 something percent of them?
Yeah, 97% for some US IT companies. I mean, generally supply chain emissions are referred to like an iceberg. So the top of the iceberg are the emissions that companies can measure and manage in their own operations. And then you've got this kind of huge swell under the water, which represents emissions in the supply chain. And manufacturing digital devices is an energy intensive business. And particularly there are issues around semiconductor manufacturing where it's quite difficult to decarbonize. And in some countries, it's very difficult to deploy renewable energy still. So there are kind of lots of challenges in being able to mitigate these emissions. But some companies are making some really good progress already. Yeah.
And you talked about how there needs to be a focus on collaboration to try and solve this. And I guess I'm just wondering whose responsibility that is, who's going to take the charge on having these suppliers all collaborate to try and make a difference?
Well, I think we can already see within the tech sector, some of the telecom companies in the UK, like BT, have taken a real leadership position on this. So BT have been working on the SME climate portal and working on supply chain initiatives with Ericsson and other players in the sector. I mean, generally, it should be the OEMs at the top of the kind of OEMs taking responsibility of their own supply chain, and then the OEMs would collaborate or should collaborate with their other partners to move the dial. One really interesting example that's starting to emerge is the Responsible Business Council, which used to be called the EICC. It was set up by the electronics industry to deal with human rights issues in supply chain. They're now starting to work together on circular economy, which has to be part also of climate action as well, because of the need to reduce emissions from raw material extraction. So really interesting to see the RBA moving into the circular economy space. And I think it's only a matter of time before we start to see them also collaborating on kind of broader climate action as well.
Yeah, excellent. I want to come back to something that you said as well, Danielle. It was quite, I think, a bold statement, and it was about demand shaping to suit the availability of green energy. And, you know, it's a really nice idea. Is it feasible commercially for businesses to do that?
That's the $1 million question. I wouldn't know. I think an even more refined question is, how do we make sure that maybe not the great performance, right, of our products and services, such as the bandwidth example, right, but how do we make sure that sustainability metrics make it to the top and business decisions, you know, are being driven by some of these metrics as well, right? I think that's a you know, a little bit more fair you know, assumption to make, and maybe a little bit more realistic, at least in the short term, right? I would say that's my answer. It is a bold statement, right? And the example itself is quite maybe I mean, it's an analogy anyway, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think obviously the example of Netflix doing it to deliver a better experience for their customers, that would not necessarily be the case for a software supplier trying to get the best out of green energy. But it is a great idea, and it would be good to see some businesses adopting some of these principles.
I think we've seen some already start to look at flexibility as part of the energy system. So Octopus Energy, for example, who call themselves a tech company, have been incentivizing users to use more energy when there's lots of renewable energy on the grid. I saw yesterday, for example, Microsoft announced that they're going to put in place a microgrid at one of their data centers in the States, and connected with a battery on site, you can start to then store energy when there's lots of green electrons on the grid and use them when they're not. Or alternatively, you might want to sell that energy, stored energy, back into the grid at times when there isn't many green electrons around, or the wind isn't blowing, or the sun isn't shining. So I think this kind of smart energy system coupled with batteries, potentially fuel cells as well, and we start to look at, data centers that can run completely kind of independently, potentially off the grid, or certainly a lot greener in terms of the electricity that they're consuming compared to today.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be fantastic, I think, to see more examples of that. And I know when we spoke last week, you mentioned that AWS are the largest deployer of renewable energy now. Microsoft, AWS, these are some huge brands with vast amounts of money at their disposal. Is there a sort of, I suppose, a practical equivalent for smaller businesses? Is there something they can be doing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important question, because the way that a lot of the tech sector's largest players have been deploying renewable energy is through something called purchase power agreements. They're very complex, they're long-term, and they do have risks associated with them that the purchaser has to take on. So they tend to be very much only in the gift of the largest companies who are willing to take on that risk and have that kind of longer term visibility. Now, there are some interesting players who are trying to bring together smaller companies to do exactly like this. So there's a company called Zygo, who has a platform that tries to bring together and de-risk PPAs for smaller companies. The other thing that smaller companies can do is to purchase green energy from their energy supplier. I think for medium-sized or larger companies, that's probably not going to be enough. Well, certainly not for larger companies. For larger companies, really the expectation is that you should be trying to bring on additional renewables onto the grid rather than buying what's already there, essentially. So I think the approach you've got to take has got to will probably vary according to size, but there is definitely solutions for every company regardless of their size at the moment. Yeah,
there's definitely things that we can all be doing to work towards it. We do have a question in the chat. It's specifically for you, Daniel. Graham Hobson asks, does ThoughtWorks track its reduced carbon emissions, and how is it linked to ESG targets?
Yeah, we're taking it pretty deep in our corporate strategy. We submitted, is not the word, committed to SBTi in 2019, and we're rigorously tracking our emissions, and everything involving our internal operations and also our client work. And in that broad spectrum, we're also accounting for the work we're doing for emissions on the tech sector, right? On our own infrastructure, right? Meaning our own cloud resources, our own technology infrastructure, and how does all that account in that bigger scheme of emissions, right? So yeah, definitely. I think I can share a link later on that, but yeah.
That's great. Thanks. Just on that, Suzanne, you mentioned about science-based targets earlier, and it's a term that I think we hear a lot. And you talked about why they're better. And I guess, my question as a non-expert is, if a company is saying that they're going to be, net zero or 50% reduction or whatever it is by a certain date, how is that not just as good as a science-based approach? If if they're saying we're going to wipe it all out, or we're going to halve it, why does it need to link to the science in order for it to be more productive?
I think it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? So I think what the Science-Based Target Initiative represents is something that WWF and other civil society players, they set it up. They came together to try and produce a rigorous approach to setting climate targets, because in the past they'd been quite arbitrary. So you'd say, I'd cut 20% of emissions by 2020 because that makes a nice soundbite. So, essentially what they tried to do is put in place rigor. Now, of course, if you can exceed that and go net zero, fantastic. I mean, that's obviously the direction of travel in the UK. So, that should be the longer term intention of UK based companies. Absolutely. I think what's important is how you're going to get there, how you plan to get there, making sure that there is that sufficient buy-in throughout the business, that there are interim targets, that there are champions across the business working on specific themes and driving action in a timely way. Now, we've always talked about this decade as being the decade of action. Scientists are telling us that this is the decade in which we need to make substantial reductions if we're going to avoid the worst of climate change. So 2050, net zero by 2050 seems an awful long way off. But actually what the science is telling us is we actually as a sector need to reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030. Now the ITU, GESI, which is the global initiative, it's the Global Electronic Sustainability Initiative, and GSMA, which is the kind of Global Mobile Association. They work together to produce some decarbonisation trajectories for digital device manufacturers, operators, and telecoms providers in the first instance, as that obviously represents the digital backbone of the sector and the trajectory of reduction emissions that they need to make in line with the Paris Agreement. And that shows us that we need to cut emissions by 45% by 2030. So I think it's really important not to look at 2050 and thinking this is still quite a way off. We don't really need to do that much now. Actually, it's quite the reverse. The science tells us we have to move quickly and rapidly now. This really is the decade in which we have the opportunity to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, and we shouldn't kind of hesitate.
Absolutely. So we just need to get started with whichever form of the target we're taking. We need to be taking some action. We've got about 3 minutes left, so I just want to quickly take a look at some of the polls and the results. So we asked how much do we think the tech sector contributes to the world's total emissions, and the majority went with 5 to 7%, but the actual answer, Suzanne, is
it's between 2 and 4%.
So not as bad as we think, but that's still a lot of the overall.
Not as bad as we think, but there are some models out there that suggest that without action, it could grow to even up to 40%. Wow. Now, that's very questionable, and I don't think we will ever get that. But I think it goes to show without intervention, without action, there is potential for us to be a much more significant emitter of carbon and user of energy than we are right now.
Yeah. We asked which scopes do individual businesses currently measure, and the greatest answers were I'm not sure, someone else takes care of it, and also no idea what is a scope. So that's possibly something that we need to work on, I think, for the rest of this year in terms of educating businesses in the region about the practical things that they should be doing. What contributes the most emissions from the tech sector? Daniel, what contributes the most emissions? So
I can see the poll though.
Yeah, well, so the audience got it right. The answers we gave were digital device manufacture and disposal, data centers, data manufacture, or blockchain. And
that's great that people got it right. It seems like we're on track on understanding this a little bit more and more. Yeah.
Yeah, so 67% went with digital device manufacture and disposal. How long does your business typically keep an electronic device in use? Only one person said until they're on their last legs. 25% at least 4 years, and the remainder going with 2 to 3 years. So thankfully, nobody replacing them more frequently than every 2 years. Which statement best represents your offsetting policy? Again, fortunately, nobody said let's offset at all. The majority, 3/4, are saying reduce as much as we can and offset the rest. And just a small percentage saying offsetting doesn't solve the problem. We're aiming for 100% reduction. That's a bold aim. Good luck. And please tell us. I'd love to chat with you and hear how you're doing that, so we can share your story with other businesses. And just finally, do you collaborate with any other businesses around your sustainability pledge or action? A couple of people, yes, are part of a formal group. Some have contacts in other businesses that they share information with, and almost half don't collaborate at all. So perhaps that's what Dynamo needs to pick up over the next few months, creating some sort of formal collaboration between businesses wanting to be more sustainable. So just really quickly, we are over time. What's the priority? What one thing should businesses be doing to help make the tech sector more sustainable? Suzanne, I'm going to come to you first.
I would say, sorry, can I just say 2 things? Set a climate target and buy green energy.
Brilliant. Good. That's good practical steps. Thanks. Daniel?
Maybe relating to one of the questions also in the chat, be agile, start small, start focused, and you don't need to tackle everything at once, and start from one product, and you can build on top of that, and analyze multiple dimensions, carbon, energy, processes, right? Product development. There are multiple things. Yeah.
There's definitely more than one there, Daniel.
Yeah.
There's so much to do. Thanks so much for your time, both of you, this morning, especially stepping in at the last minute. Not that anybody would have known. Brilliant presentations and really interesting content. I appreciate your time. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.